right, welcome back everyone. Today we are going over the note sheet for the first subunit of the three subunits within American Romanticism, which is the Knickerbocker School, sometimes called the Knickerbocker Group. They're a little known association of American writers that, outside of survey courses in American literature and then some specialty courses dealing with early American literature, the literature of the early Republic, they're not that well known. You have three major authors within this group that you've probably heard of: Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, William Cullen Bryant. Now, there are many other minor authors within this school, but for the most part, unless you're a scholar of early America, you're not really reading their writings. You may know some of the famous texts because of film versions. So, for example, Washington Irving writes Legend of Sleepy Hollow that we get the Tim Burton version of, as well as the Disney version of, both of which relatively inaccurate compared to the story. We'll talk about that later. And then you may know James Fenimore Cooper by way of Last of the Mohicans, very famous film. But outside of that, we don't really talk about these authors all that often, which is a real shame because I think it's some of the best American literature that we have in the 19th century. Some of the most interesting, and it's also from a historical perspective, absolutely foundational to everything that comes after. In fact, in many ways, we can say Washington Irving, who was the leader of the Knickerbocker School. In fact, the name Knickerbocker School comes from him. He has a narrator character by the name of Diedrich Knickerbocker, who is a Dutch historian who narrates a lot of sketches, stories, the most famous being the legend of, not the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, oh shoot, why am I blanking on the name? Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle is narrated by Diedrich Knickerbocker, and he creates this character. Everybody loves the character, and so sort of humorously, they start calling themselves the Knickerbocker Group, the Knickerbocker School. They publish a literary magazine conveniently called The Knickerbocker, which Washington Irving is the editor for about a decade. And they kind of group themselves that way. So much like the later Transcendentalists, who will arrange themselves by essentially the people who are part of the original Transcendental Club, and then later people who participate in the Transcendentalist literary magazine known as The Dial. The Knickerbocker School or group kind of emerges around this particular scene. And the writers have a number of things in common. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them grow up in the New York, New Jersey area. And their fascination, and this is something I don't have on the note sheet as such, but it's important to understand, their primary fascination is what we would call in the telluric nature of the American Republic, or the aspects of the American Republic that are telluric. And what that means is related to the earth, related to nature. So they are not interested in civil society as such, nor are they interested in whatever, like the things that come with it, the cities. They're not interested, primarily speaking, in the culture of New England. They're interested in the interior, in the wilderness, in the untamed American landscape. Because one of the central concerns for the authors of this school, and I mentioned this previously when we went over the general Romanticism notes, is nationalism. And you see this here, nationalism. What is American identity? Who are the American people? Because let's think about this for a moment. In the early days of the American Enlightenment, we have two groups of people. You have the anti-federalists, you have the federalists. You have the groups of people that will side with Hamilton and Washington. You have the groups of people who will become the Jeffersonian Democrats. And as we talked about in the lectures on Philip Freneau and his poetry, the Jeffersonian Democrats were internationalist in their orientation geopolitically. They did not believe in nationalism. They were interested in a republic of smallholders, but not a large nation grouping them together. And what they saw is, hey, the revolution of enlightened thought is going to spread over Europe, is going to spread to all the world, and we're not going to have kingdoms or dynasties or anything resembling nation states. We are just going to be essentially as close as we can get to atomistic individuals, buying and selling. So they're very internationalist in their orientation. They believe in a universal human nature. They don't really emphasize culture all that much. And you see that in Philip Freneau's poetry. It's very enlightened in its orientation, but there's nothing you could say, this is very specifically American. It's more philosophical. It's not as grounded in what is telluric, in the earth, in the soil. Now, the Federalists are very different. The Federalists do want to create a nation state. They do want to move in the direction of things like national bank, national army, so on and so forth. And this comes out in the writing of the Knickerbocker School, who are primarily Federalists. Particularly Washington Irving is a major Federalist writer. And as they're looking out at the landscape, culturally and otherwise, of America, their big question is, okay, we have this young republic. We're the first generation to be born after the Revolution. In fact, Washington Irving gets his name from General Washington. So we're the first generation to be born after the Revolution. And what we are curious about is we're in this young country, we're in this new state of affairs that has never existed in world history, the creation of this country. That is not an ethnos, but it is a demos, and that is actually a republic. And so the question is, what defines America? What does it mean to be an American? Because even though most of us are English, meaning like we're Anglo in terms of our phenotype, genetics, whatever, and even though most of us speak English, we are not English. This is a huge idea, is that there is something that separates Americans from the English. And so as they start to think about it and conceptualize it consciously or unconsciously through the literature, the writers of the Knickerbocker School, most particularly Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, a little bit less so William Cullen Bryant, I would say in part because he was born in Boston, but in any case, or maybe not Boston, but Massachusetts. He was from New England. But the point being, as they start to think about this, they go, okay, well, what are the two major differences between us and the British? So you can say three. One, of course, is republicanism, the idea of democracy, liberalism, free trade, enlightenment. That's obviously there. But the two ones they emphasize even more are the landscape of America, meaning the size of America, the American wilderness, the fact that America is, in relation to England, absolutely enormous, wild, untamed. And two, the presence of Native Americans. The Native American starts to be seen as an exalted figure. Now, you see a little bit of this in the Enlightenment with the idea of the noble savage, but this really picks up in the Knickerbocker School as, wow, there is something really noble about the Native Americans and that they embody us in some way. I always think about this, for example, the famous brand of cigarettes, American Spirits, right? What's on the American Spirit? It's a Native American. The idea is that like the American spirit, the ethos or essence of America is present in the Native Americans. Now, obviously, a lot of not so good stuff happens to the Native Americans during the period of the Knickerbocker School, roughly from 1810 to 1840-ish, right? 1810, very, very early. 1830s, I would say, is sort of the heyday of the Knickerbocker School, where you get the magazine, the Knickerbocker. But during this 30-year period, you have the ascendancy of the major and minor writers within this school. And they're essentially saying, no, America does have a distinct national identity that separates us from England. So England is, it's like the Shire. It's quiet. Everybody's got their little, cubby hole. And there's no real wilderness until you go to Scotland. Maybe Wales. But like Scotland for sure, wilderness. But England, it's nice, it's countryside, it's civilized, it's like the Shire. Whereas the idea for the Knickerbocker School writers is, no, in America we actually have this savage, untamed wilderness. So this is where we start to get to the development of folklore legends, national mythos. And so one of the key aspects of our national mythos is the Oregon Trail, right, in the 1840s. So this is after the period of Washington Irving. The Knickerbocker School is already starting to die off, but there is a series of articles published in 1846 in the Knickerbocker about the Oregon Trail and the noble pioneers who cross in search of a better life, in search of freedom, in search of, all these sort of American ideals, and they tame the wilderness. They go out into the wilderness, they love the wilderness, they embrace the wilderness, but they ultimately tame it. That is a major idea for the American mythos, that we have this sort of pioneer, settler, colonial culture, and we go out into the wilderness. The wilderness is what is going to develop us and make us into Americans. Very present in the Knickerbocker School. And you see this in a lot of different things, because earlier Knickerbocker writing, a lot of it is just sketches of nature or talking about life in the American interior. In fact, some people have argued, I'm not going to sort of weigh in on this, but you can go look into the claims. Some people have said the American magazine, the Knickerbocker, the literary magazine of this particular group, is the first environmentalist magazine, because they do show a concern with, actually, in spite of this sort of tension between taming the wilderness and being in the wilderness, they do show a concern for the fact that certain aspects of American life in the wilderness are disappearing as we move into the interior. And so this idea of untamed nature is really important. And you see this in the art, which is why I chose this particular image. You probably have seen this before. This is Thomas Cole, probably the first majorly famous American painter. He's part of a group of artists called the Hudson River School. And the Hudson River School really is just the Knickerbocker School, but in the visual arts. In fact, Thomas Cole, believe it or not, he wrote for the magazine The Knickerbocker. So in some sense, you could call Thomas Cole a Knickerbocker School author, a minor one. Obviously, he's more famous as a painter, but he's definitely associated with this. And he has this famous painting, the Oxbow. You can see it here. We have down, let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. We have sort of these farms, settled nature, settled landscape, the beauty of American nature, the vastness of it. But notice the sort of dynamism of the composition, right? We have this sort of crescent right here developing right as you move the curve along the wilderness, going up into the dark clouds. The dark clouds kind of romantic, mysterious. We can't tell what's going on. There's going to be a thunderstorm, kind of sublime. The tree itself looks lightning blasted, looks like a lightning bolt in some sense. You can see, actually, if you look very, very closely, you see someone painting. I believe there's a Native American somewhere in here, though I can't remember exactly where. But what you see here is the wild, savaged, untamed American wilderness. And this is sort of a dialectic that we talked about between civilization and wilderness, with the fascination being on the earth, on the landscape, and on, what would you say, the non-mercantile aspects of American culture. This will come out in Washington Irving. So Washington Irving, if you don't know, he writes 3 famous short stories that we are going to read in this particular subunit. The first is The Devil and Tom Walker, the second is Rip Van Winkle, and the third is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And what's interesting about them is Devil and Tom Walker is a sketch of New England. And one of the interesting characteristics of the Knickerbocker School is this focus on satire and parody. We are going to make humorous portrayals of American types, like stock American characters, because when we make a humorous portrayal of them and everyone recognizes it as funny, we're building part of sort of the national essence. And so the idea that comes up in The Devil and Tom Walker is that people from New England are religiously hypocritical and super stingy and concerned with money. So this idea that, hey, the New England dominance that we've seen in American letters for the past 200 years is run by a culture that's focused entirely on trade, on commerce, and we define ourselves as being against them. Then in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, you have the opposite. It's a tale of New York told from the interior, told from the perspective of the Dutch, and that culture is far less political. Things move slower. Things are more focused on the land, on things like fishing, farming, going to the tavern. Life moves at a completely different pace, and money is not the primary focus of that culture. And in fact, what's made fun of there is that everybody in the interior moves kind of slowly, is kind of lazy, so on and so forth. But we see a clear dialectic emerging between the coastal cities of New England and the interior, New York primarily. Then, in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, we have 2 characters, Ichabod Crane, who is representative of the New England tendency, and Brom Bones, who is representative of the telluric interior wilderness tendency, who engage in a cultural conflict. If you don't know, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it's actually meant to be a funny story. It's satirical. It's not at all gothic, which is something Tim Burton, and obviously I think most people in our sort of modern conception of it, get wrong. It's not about a haunted legend, a haunted place, anything like that. It's about the clash of civilizations between these 2 distinct American regional cultures. New England, which is hypocritical, pharisaical, concerned with commerce, and the telluric interior, which is, focused on strength, which is wild, which is savage, which is untamed, which is in control and exerts some form of dominance over the earth. Okay? These are primary characteristics of the Knickerbocker School. I'll go through these a little bit more organized in a minute, but if I have confused you in any way, please leave comments. I love getting comments. I love reading comments. I'm happy to clarify anything. Okay, so going back, central question of the Knickerbocker School writers is, what is American identity? Who are the American people? This is where we start to get the first major American short stories, texts, plays, so on and so forth. Now, the second aspect of this is fantasy and magic. Romanticism in nature over cold rationalism. So the party that supports Jeffersonian democracy, the party of people that will evolve into Jacksonian Democrats, the Locofocos, so on, like proto-libertarians, that party of people tends to be more rationalist and internationalist in their associations. So think Philip Freneau. It's all about the religion of nature, what we can explain rationally, so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, the school of people that come from Hamilton, Clay, Washington, and the writers of the Knickerbocker School, who are Federalists, they're more interested in fantasy and magic. So they have this sense of life is kind of charmed. We're going to write about or focus on the aspects of life that cannot be reduced to pure reason. And associated with that, we're going to write about the aspects of life that are associated with a particular American landscape. So this blends into folklore and legends. Let's even if we have to invent them, let's tell the stories of the American people. Because there's an idea that if we want to express what America is, we need to tell the stories of Americans. So think about, for example, the Brothers Grimm in Germany. What do the Brothers Grimm do? They go all around Germany collecting stories from different people, putting them into a neutral German that most Germans can understand, and saying, hey, these stories express, what do you want to say? They express like the Germanic tendency. Okay, they express the Teutonic essence of what it is to be German. And so the collecting of these legends and folk stories in Europe presents, hey, this is who we are as a people. Well, in America, they're obviously doing this with a young country. Now, there has been 200 years of American experience, and that is what Washington Irving is going to draw on as an example. But a lot of these are invented whole cloth. Like, for the most part, the story of Rip Van Winkle is an invention of Washington Irving. But he invents this story that could be a folk legend, right? That is presented as being true, right? He has Diedrich Knickerbocker, the narrator, say, oh yeah, this story is true, I've investigated it, so on and so forth. But he presents them as legends that go way back because they're inventing a common national mythos or legend, so that we now have characters we can look to define Americanness. And again, this blends into the idea of national heroes. So for example, Irving writes a number of famous biographies, and they're kind of different figures, okay? The three major biographies he writes obviously a biography of General and President Washington, very, very famous, was read in American schools until like the 1950s. Biography of Christopher Columbus, and then he also writes a biography of Muhammad, which is an interesting one. The biography of Muhammad actually comes about because, if you don't know, Washington Irving was an ambassador to Spain. He spends a good amount of time in Spain. He writes a number of stories about Spain. I think he's got one called Legends of the Alhambra, and a number of other sketches and stories about Spain. And he becomes very fascinated by the Arab aspects of Andalusia, like Andalusian culture in the south of Spain. And he starts doing research into the Islamic world. And this is something that's easier to do because of Orientalism, translations of texts coming in from the East. And he publishes biographies of Muhammad. And a lot of people say, actually, that the two sets of biographies that he has of Muhammad are influential on, take a guess, Joseph Smith. Because why? Joseph Smith is coming out of all this Orientalist discourse. There are all these aspects of Mormonism that involve Egyptology as one of the primary ones, but then also the study of the Islamic world. And so there's this idea that the first American religion, the religion that belongs to us, the religion that's developed on American soil, the religion that is more American than apple pie, which is Mormonism, has its sort of ideological roots in the study of the Islamic world, of course, because polygamy is common to both of them, or at least it was. I know Mormons no longer practice polygamy for the most part, but in the early days, obviously, we know Brigham Young, Joseph Smith, so on and so forth. Well, where does that idea come from? There's an idea that comes from the Orientalist text and also from Washington Irving, who wrote this extraordinarily popular biography of Muhammad. And we have plays from Knickerbocker School writers about Muhammad. There are all these sort of different things going on. But in any case, going back to the other two biographies. So obviously, the biography of Washington, the cherry tree, all these famous stories, I cannot tell a lie, crossing, whatever, the Delaware, like all these different things. Those are sketches that are made in the biography of Washington. And the idea is, hey, Washington represents the ideal American tendency. He is what it is to be an American, the same way that like Don Quixote is what it is to be a Spaniard. Like to be a Spaniard is to be like Quixote in some way. Well, for Americans, the idea is being like Washington. Or like Columbus, who obviously is Genovese, spends a significant amount of time in Spain, whatever. But the idea is, no, Columbus is representative of the American tendency. And this is where we get all the myths about Columbus. Like, for example, that Columbus was the first person who thought the earth was round. That's not true. I remember being taught that when I was in preschool. And I remember the teacher reading all these sort of, the nice, well-illustrated children's books about Columbus and about how Columbus thought the world was round, this, that, the other. I don't think they do that in American schools anymore for probably obvious reasons. But the idea was, like, Columbus represents who we are. That's why we named the capital, right? D.C., District of Columbia, right? We are Columbia. We are the land of Columbus. And so Washington Irving's biography of Columbus, yes, it invents this story about Columbus that's very entertaining, but it also invents the American identity. That no, we are men like Columbus. And that's going to come out in a lot of different places in the United States. The capital of my state, right, where I'm from, Ohio, is Columbus. and there are all sorts of the Knights of Columbus, right? So on and so forth. We have all these things named after Columbus. Where does that come from? Primarily Washington Irving's biography of Columbus. Satire parody, making fun of different regional demographics and associations. And then finally, the explosion in literary forms. So this is where we get like all these different types of texts. So if you go back and read, and you can find them on archive.org, you go back and read old editions of the Knickerbocker, we're seeing, oh my goodness, we have poems, we have short stories, we have the sketch, which is slightly different than a short story, we have novels, we have plays, we have all these different things. For example, another great thing that comes out of the Knickerbocker School and from a major Federalist writer is Daniel Webster, who publishes, take a wild guess, excuse me, not Daniel Webster the statement, Noah Webster. What does Noah Webster publish? He publishes Webster's Dictionary. We get the first American dictionary where we have American words, American spellings, which Webster essentially invents, saying, hey, these are more rationalistic ways of spelling words. We're less concerned with etymology. We're more concerned with pragmatism, how to teach children how to spell. He produces a blue book, like a speller, that is used in all these different American primary schools for years and years and years and years, and develops the way that we spell color. He says is more rational. It makes more sense. It's more enlightened, and it's less focused on tradition, history, and etymology. So he frees Americans from the weight of their English past, from the weight of European etymologies, and says, no, we're going to invent words, we're going to invent spellings, and we're going to add words that we have already invented from our vernacular and put them in the dictionary. So rather than the Oxford English Dictionary, which is very, very, very traditional, very, very philological, comes out of, obviously, Samuel Johnson, we are going to produce a dictionary that focuses on the things that we find to be useful. Pragmatism, practical use value. How can I teach things easier? How can I be less concerned with the weight of the past, history, and etymology? So we get all these really cool, interesting things that just sort of explode. And part of that is also related to the fact that now the market economy for literature is starting to pick up. Now, it's going to really screw over writers like Hawthorne, Melville, and Poe, who are all going to be basically broke. I mean, Hawthorne's major life dilemma is, when I'm writing great art, I have no money. And when I'm working a job and providing for my family, I'm not producing great art. And there is no middle ground between those two things. Which is why Hawthorne has that comment that everybody says is misogynistic about the scribbling masses of women. That's because he hated the literary market. He's like, I hate the tastes that are cultivated by it. I hate the fact that writing great literature means I'm not going to be in demand. And we'll talk about that a lot when we get to the Gothic. But these authors all make a killing. James Fenimore Cooper makes tons of money off his stories, novels about Natty Bumppo, and also his sea novels, which become very influential on Melville. William Cullen Bryant is insanely rich by the time he dies. Like, he's rich. And Washington Irving, obviously he had diplomatic posts and government posts, but he's considered the first American writer to be a man of letters in the sense that he makes all of his money, or at least makes most of his money, from his writing and has experienced financial success as a writer, which not like many writers prior to that had experienced. So really interesting characteristics. You start to see the emergence of the Republic, the emergence of these distinct American national identities. If you have questions about what this means, please leave them in the comments. Some of this will start to be clear as we go through some of the authors. I'll start to post videos on Irving, Fenimore Cooper, so on and so forth. As always, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. And by the way, I would be remiss. I get this question a lot of like, how did you learn all this stuff? How many hours a day do you read? What does your schedule look like? Because I think a common anxiety we have as people who are interested in intellectual things is, am I doing enough? How do I make sure I'm doing enough? And what are the ways I can guarantee my success? And one thing I noticed is there are not a lot of what you could call self-improvement programs or self-improvement literature related to people who want to be artists or intellectuals. It's all related to business. And so I put together a course that is in pre-sale right now about the intellectual life that has everything you would want out of a self-help book, but that is not focused on business. It's a series of 22 lectures on how to use music, how to use film, what languages to learn, how often to study, how often to write. It's everything you want to know about the intellectual life put into one course, and you can find that in the description. Take a look at it. I think if you even just click at it and you look at the different lectures, you're going to go, oh my goodness, there is nothing like this, because there's not. I invented it. So take a look at that. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you all around in the next video. Take care, guys.